So we've talked about what was going on the continent in Germany and Italy and France. But meanwhile, in England, there were also very interesting things happening about religion, especially. Remember that they've just gotten on, we've just finished the Hundred Years' War, and at the end of the Hundred Years' War, one of the things that's happening that makes the English abandon the war is the fact they're having a civil war, the War of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York. Ultimately, the leader of the House of Lancaster is Henry VII. He becomes King Henry VII, and he's actually not a Lancaster so much as he is a subset of the Lancasters. He is a Tudor. He defeats Richard III in the War of the Roses, and he reigns from 1509 to 1547, about 38. I take that back. That isn't him. That's actually Henry VIII, his son. Henry VII is the father of Henry Tudor that you see here. And the Tudors were a very devoutly Catholic group of people. And originally, Henry VII's oldest son, Arthur, marries a woman by the name of Catherine of Aragon. This is before Arthur becomes the king. When Henry VIII, his second, the next brother in line, is 12 years old, Arthur dies. Arthur's already married. He has a wife, but she has not yet born him any children. The person that he marries, that Arthur marries, is a Spanish princess. This woman, Catherine of Aragon, is the daughter of the king and queen of Spain. And remember, there is nobody more Catholic in Europe than the Spanish. So when Henry is 12 years old, he is married off to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. She's quite a bit older than he is, and it takes a special papal dispensation, an order from the Pope that allows them to be married. There are prohibitions in the Bible about marrying about marrying your brother's widow. And so for them to get married legally in the Catholic Church, there has to be a special dispensation by the Pope granted, but it is. And so Henry VIII, who eventually becomes a king, is married to Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII has seen his country torn apart by this civil war, the War of the Roses, and that was fought over succession issues. So he knows it's really important that he has a son. And so he and Catherine get right on it and to have a child. And in 1511, Henry VIII is presented with a son who would have been Henry IX. However, that child lives for only 2 weeks and then he dies. Catherine of Aragon gets pregnant many, many times, several more times, but she never has a living son. The only child that she gives birth to who survives is her daughter named Mary, and Mary lives, and she is born in 1516 after Henry the eighth is already on the throne. Remember, he's on the throne from 1509 to 1547, and so he has a daughter by Catherine of Aragon. He thinks that God is punishing them, and that's why they can't have a living son. And that God is punishing them because they shouldn't have gotten married in the first place. That the Pope should not have given that dispensation. God's punishing him and Catherine for them getting married after the Bible says that a man should not marry his brother's widow. And the other problem here, of course, is that Henry knows that he can father a healthy baby boy because in 1519, his mistress gives birth to a healthy baby boy, an illegitimate son whom he does not claim, but whom he does take care of. I think his name is Henry Fitzwilliam, but he never has any power. He just has some wealth from his father. So because they cannot have a legitimate male son, Henry asks Catherine for an annulment. He wants this marriage to be declared like illegitimate, and so he asks her to join a convent, and she says absolutely not. And the Pope says nope, not going to do it. And so he has the ranking Catholic bishop in all of England, the man who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name is Thomas Cranmer, annul the marriage. And Thomas Cranmer does annul the marriage. The Pope throws a fit about this. Catherine refuses to join a convent, and so Henry says, not going to have anything more to do with Rome. We'll run our own show here. And he passes something called the Act of Supremacy. And the Act of Supremacy says that the king, not the Pope, is the head of the Church of England. And at this point, he assumes it's going to be like the Catholic Church of England, but it becomes what we call today the Church of England or the Anglican Church. In annulling Catherine of Aragon, divorcing, this annulment is basically a divorce. In divorcing at Catherine of Aragon, he also makes Mary, their living daughter, an illegitimate child because she's no longer the child of a legitimate marriage. And so that's an important thing to note because Mary will live with that stigma and sort of some anger about that for the rest of her natural days. But his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, is divorced. He takes up with his next wife, Anne Boleyn. She had been a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. There are a lot of interesting stories about Anne Boleyn, that she was really more of a political pawn of her father as much as anything else. There's also some discussion that Henry had really wanted to have an affair with her married sister instead. But she was good looking enough, and he marries her, and she bears him a daughter in 1533, whose name is Elizabeth. She proceeds to have, but it's a daughter, right? It's not a son yet. She proceeds to have two miscarriages. And because these two miscarriages happen and he's only got a daughter, Henry becomes particularly brutal. And he begins to, persecute certain people in his realm, including Thomas More, who we'll talk a little bit more about later. Eventually, because she doesn't give birth to a living son, because he only has this daughter, he accuses her of adultery. They'd already annulled the marriage, said it wasn't legitimate, but he accuses her of adultery. And the annulment itself should have voided the adultery charge. If the marriage wasn't legitimate, she can do whatever she wants to, right? But it doesn't. And so he has her beheaded for adultery. And because he annulled her first before he beheaded her, this then bastardizes or makes illegitimate not just Mary, his first daughter, but Elizabeth, his second daughter as well. So currently he has no legitimate children according to law of the time, church law at the time. And he has had two wives, one of whom he's divorced and the second of whom he has beheaded. He is not done, of course. His third wife is a woman by the name of Jane Seymour. And he proposes to her, betroths her one day after Anne is beheaded. The story of Anne Boleyn's beheading, by the way, is really kind of awful. She goes to the block at the tower, and she asks for a French swordman because they have sharper swords and they're stronger. She wants to be beheaded in a single blow of the sword. And so they've pulled her hair up so that the swordsman can see her neck, and she's got her head lying on the block, and the sword comes down, and I don't believe it gets her on the first blow. On the second blow, it beheads her. And of course, whenever they behead someone, even clear up into the French Revolution, they always hold the head up for the crowd to see because it takes 4 minutes for the brain to die. They want the last sight of the deceased, assuming your brain can still work and your eyes can still see. They want the last thing for you to register in your consciousness is this cheering crowd because of your death. Her lips apparently were still moving in prayer at the time. So it was kind of, Anne Boleyn's story is really sad and kind of interesting, but sad. He marries Jane Seymour a day after Anne is beheaded, and she is not somebody who has any royalty in her, but she was the daughter of a courtier, of a minor. They're not nobility; they're just somebody who hangs out with the court. And Jane Seymour has, to her credit, helping Henry to reconcile with Mary, his first daughter, so that Mary doesn't just hate him forever. Mary and Catherine of Aragon have gone back to Spain. Why wouldn't they? She gives birth to his only son, Edward. He is born in 1537, and Henry VIII is over the moon because he finally has his son. Jane dies from complications of childbirth about 12 days after Edward is born. And so Edward has a father, and his father has a son, but his father no longer has a wife, and his child no longer has a mother. So 3 wives so far: Catherine, Anne, Jane, and they are divorced, beheaded, died. Well, Henry's single now, so he doesn't have to marry anybody to have a son because he's got his son and he's single. And so he decides to make a marriage of political convenience. He needed some Protestant allies, some Germans to help him out. And so he kind of sends out someone, specifically Thomas Cromwell, to go out looking for a sister of a German prince or a German duke that he can marry so that he can have some German support. And Thomas Cromwell finds for him the sister of the Duke of Cleves. Her name is Anne of Cleves. And Cromwell makes this match. He arranges this marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves. He brings Henry a portrait done by Hans Holbein of Anne of Cleves, and he approves the marriage. And so here comes Anne of Cleves. She sails across the English Channel. She gets off the boat at Dover. She takes one step onto English land, and apparently Henry turns to whoever's next to him and says, I like her not. Apparently she wasn't that attractive, and so he decided he did not want to marry her. But it was too late. He had already committed, and he didn't want to make the Germans angry with him by not marrying her. And so he marries her, but they divorce 6 months later. She accepts the title of Queen's sister, or of King's sister, and she makes out like a bandit. She gets all kinds of property and money in the settlement because, why wouldn't she? And she gets to live her life the way she wants to, which is actually, she didn't do so badly. She's one of the wealthiest women in the world at the time, and she gets to kind of run her own show. And gosh, there aren't very many women for whom that is true. So as a result, Cromwell, his advisor, however, is executed. So we now have 4 wives. We have Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves. They are divorced, beheaded, died, divorced. But our boy Henry is not done yet. There's this hottie hanging out at the court by the name of Catherine Howard. She's 19 years old. Now, you have to know that at this point, Henry VIII is an older man. He's probably in his 40s or 50s. He had an accident on a horse as a younger man, and it never managed to heal correctly. So he has this ulcer on his leg that will not heal. It's kind of nasty. It's always oozing something, and it smells like death. She's 19 years old, and she's hot, and she's married to a man who, because of his injuries, doesn't move very much. So he's gotten very fat, and he's got this smelly, oozing leg wound. And there she is. She had been a lady in waiting to Anne of Cleves, and he marries her 19 days after he divorces Anne of Cleves. But man, she doesn't want to be stuck with this old, fat, smelly dude. So she gets around a bit, and she unfortunately is caught with 2 different men at the same time and is obviously accused of adultery. And so she is executed with 2 of her lovers in 1542. So we have divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded again, and you have Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine. They aren't really very particularly inventive with names at this time. I don't know if you've gotten that yet, but yeah, we have Anne, Catherine, and Jane as the only 3 names that we've got so far. Here's a picture of the dude that the 19-year-old married. He's gotten a little portly, and you can't see his smelly leg. I mean, it would help, I think, if you get the whole effect as you thought about Henry VIII. When he was a young man, Henry VIII was hot, and he was a great horseman, and all the ladies wanted to get with Henry VIII. But as an old man, this was not true. I wanted to show you the second portrait of Henry VIII. I think this is also a Holbein. The last one you looked at was stretched funnily by one of the teachers who taught the class with me. I mean, he's not quite as wide as the last picture, but he's still, well, he's not all that attractive. He is the king. That makes him attractive because, with power and wealth comes some level of attractiveness. But this was Henry VIII. Finally, he marries one last woman, and her name is Catherine Parr. By this time, he's an older man. He's got a son. Everything's good. She's not expected to bear children. She marries him out of a sense of duty to be his companion, and she outlives him. So he dies while he is married to her. So if you do the whole list of wives, it is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and it's Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and the way to remember her is she's a hoe, right? So Catherine Howard, and then Catherine Parr is the one who survives. You can also remember the last 2 Catherines as coming in alphabetical order, Howard first, Parr second. So one more time, Catherine, Jane, Anne. Nope, did it wrong. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, Catherine. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry VIII dies. Edward VI, his son, becomes the king. He's 9 years old at the time. This is in 1547 that Henry VIII died. Edward is 9 years old, and there's a council that's chosen to help him rule. So he becomes king. This council helps him to strengthen the idea of Protestantism. They don't become Catholic under him, they become more Protestant. He passes two things, an Act of Uniformity and a Book of Common Prayer. The Act of Uniformity is meant to bring everybody under the same church as much as possible. And then the Book of Common Prayer is created so that even if you're a little more Catholic than you are Anglican, you're saying the same sort of prayers at the same time. And so it's sort of based on a book of hours in a way, but it's the Book of Common Prayer that all English people are to use. It's written by Thomas Cranmer, who we talked about earlier, and it's really the first liturgy done in English. Unfortunately, Edward doesn't live very long. He dies of tuberculosis 7 years after he takes the throne, so he rules until 1553. And then guess what? He doesn't have an heir. At 16, he doesn't have a son. What a surprise. So what are they going to do? Who's going to be the next king or queen or whatever? Whew, it creates an issue. So the issue is that technically speaking, the next one in line would be his daughter Mary, his oldest daughter. But remember, she's in Spain and she's really, really Catholic. And so none of the Protestants want her to come back and be their queen. And of course, the people in England who are Catholic, and there still are quite a few Catholics in England, don't really want Elizabeth, his second daughter, and she doesn't have a clear line to the throne anyway. And so they decide that maybe who they ought to have as their queen is a woman by the name of Lady Jane Grey. She is his great niece, and through his brother Arthur, I think, maybe not through Arthur, but through someone else. Anyway, she's his great niece, maybe through his father's side. Anyway, and so they managed to name her Edward's successor after he dies by Edward's regents, because they think that they can control her and they can kind of stay in control, or they can kind of stay in power, and they like that. She was like, I don't really want to do this. Please don't make me do this, but it doesn't matter. They kind of force her into the position. She rules for 9 days. She's never actually crowned, but she rules for 9 days, and then Mary and her forces come flying in with the Spanish help, and they take her prisoner and they execute her. And then Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, who is the Spanish princess / queen, becomes the Queen of England. So Mary Tudor becomes the queen. She is married off to Philip II of Spain, and he is the current king of Spain. And so there she is. She is a princess married to like a first cousin who's the king of Spain. And she has to be in England ruling England, and he's got to be in Spain ruling Spain. So they spent most of their years apart. So if you're not doing the hibbity dibbity, you're not having children. So they don't have an heir, and that's kind of a problem for both thrones eventually. Sir Thomas Wyatt, who is a famous Englishman, leads a rebellion to protest their marriage. He doesn't want to see these two married because he doesn't want to see England become part of the Spanish royalty. He doesn't want to be ruled by Spaniards. And because he does that, they execute him for treason. They believe that Elizabeth, her younger sister, is a co-conspirator of his, and they put her in the Tower of London for 2 months as a co-conspirator. But she never actually is put on trial, and she actually is allowed out, and is not ever anything exciting happens to her. Nothing. I mean, she survives the whole thing, and that's probably good. When all of that happened, Elizabeth was about 21 years old, so she spent 2 months in jail as a co-conspirator at the age of 21. Thomas Cranmer is out there, and he's still hanging out there, and he's somebody who is actually helping Mary reign. He's a Catholic, and he appoints a new Archbishop of Canterbury, and he appoints somebody who is specifically sympathetic to the Catholics and wants to return power over England to the Pope. So that's something that's very important. And Cranmer does that. He's a good Catholic, and he's going to help Mary turn England back into a Catholic country, which is what she wants to do. As a result, she becomes known in history as Bloody Mary because she believed it was better to be dead than to be a Protestant. Um, so she has a lot of Protestants executed over time. She goes through, one of the persons that she gets rid of is the one who was Archbishop of Canterbury, who annulled her mother's marriage. Thomas, is it a Thomas? I'm looking. Sorry, please forgive me. Thomas, yes, Thomas Cranmer. She has him executed eventually, even though he's a Catholic, and she dies. She only reigns for 5 years. She takes she takes the throne at age of 37. She dies 5 years later at 42. She had more than 280 religious dissenters burned at the stake, but she dies with no children, and so the throne goes to her sister Elizabeth, and it is a clear title for Elizabeth to be able to take that throne. Tomorrow we will talk about Elizabethan England, and then we will be done. I lied. I think we're going to finish off Elizabethan England in this particular thing so that we can be done. So Elizabeth I takes the throne in 1558 and rules until 1603. So she has a very, very long reign. 45 years is a long time to sit on the throne. She's a very important Queen of England, a very strong Queen of England, and a lot of cool things happen under her. Even so, Elizabeth sitting on the throne put a big strain between Spain and England and relations between the two. Philip II, who had been married to her older sister Mary, assumed that he would get to marry Elizabeth, kind of like his dad married his brother's wife, that he would marry his sister's sister, or his wife's sister. He assumes that he's going to marry Elizabeth, and she's not having that, and so that strains her relationship. Additionally, Elizabeth decides to send troops to the Netherlands because at the time, the Netherlands, in Northern Europe, was actually controlled by Spain. And so they were rebelling. They're kind of rising up against the Spanish. So she sent some troops just to make sure that the Spanish did not win. That certainly didn't help anything in their relationship. And finally, she has this guy by the name of Sir Francis Drake, a name that I know that you've heard in history. And she has him attack the Spanish treasure ships that are coming back from the New World to steal silver and gold and all the treasures that they're getting. And they really are pirates more than anything else. But Elizabeth thinks that he's fantastic, and she knights him for all of the good work that he's doing against the Spanish. So that doesn't really endear her to the Spanish as well. So Elizabeth is 25 years old when she takes the throne, but she never marries in the entirety of her being on the throne. In all those years. She is known, therefore, as the Virgin Queen because, of course, if you never marry anybody, you're a virgin, because certainly you wouldn't have sex out of marriage, and certainly not in the 1500s. We don't know that that's true. We know that she had a lot of suitors. We know that she had specific men that she really liked and probably did have as lovers, but she never got pregnant by any of them. Oftentimes, one of the reasons we think that she stayed single is because it gave her negotiation power, because she could promise to marry somebody, they could maybe, and then they figured that they would get to take over if they were married to her because they were the man and were looking at pretty traditional gender roles at the time. But she used marriage as sort of a negotiating chip in diplomatic relations, which is sort of interesting. By entertaining Catholic suitors, people who are Catholic, as maybe possible marriage, she could keep her Catholic subjects kind of pacified and keep them loyal, but she also kept the Catholic countries from attacking her because it looked like, well, maybe if we give her time, she'll come around to being Catholic again. Robert Dudley is the one guy who probably was her lover. He was the Earl of Leicester, and she always, and both his father and grandfather had been executed for treason under her sister Mary. His wife died mysteriously. She, I believe, quote unquote, fell down the stairs, but it looked more like maybe she had been pushed downstairs. We're not sure. But the two of them were seen together a lot, and she hung on to his last letter was very important. The last letter that he wrote her, she hangs on to, and it's the last letter she receives from him before his death, and she never lets go, but she always has it forever. So we think that probably he was a lover of hers. One of the highlights of Elizabeth's reign was when the English beat the Spanish Armada. And you have to know that this would kind of be sort of like maybe Brazil, not a small country, not a weak country, but beating the United States Navy. I mean, it's a big deal because that Navy should never be able to even practically challenge the U.S. Navy. And the Spanish Armada is the strongest navy at that time on Earth and pretty much undefeatable. In 1588, they were sailing toward England with the idea that they were maybe going to attack, but the English got word of it. Not that that would necessarily help them, right? Because it's a much bigger navy. But Sir Francis Drake, one of the sea dogs, one of the guys who's gone up against these big Spanish galleons before to pirate them for their treasures that they're bringing from the New World, leads a flotilla of English ships, boats, dinghies, rowboats, whatever they could. They took out to meet the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada had some issues. The first thing is that they took off too quickly from Spain. And, you can't drink salt water. So on these ships, you would have to carry all of your fresh water. And what do you carry fresh water in? You carry them in big barrels. Well, barrels are made of wood and a little bit of metal. There's a metal ring on them. And then there's a sort of pitch, a kind of tar that's used to seal all the cracks so your water does not leak out. But that tar has got to cure. And until it cures, your barrels are green. And that tar is going to leach into your water in such a way that it will contaminate the water and make your sailors sick. Well, they didn't wait for the barrels to cure. So all the water on these Spanish galleons was essentially contaminated, and the sailors were all sick. There's also a bit of a storm, which they call the Protestant wind, that blows the Spanish Armada off course. And the English used things like unmanned fire ships. So they would set fires to small ships that were highly maneuverable, and they would just run them into these huge ships that couldn't maneuver very quickly or very easily and start them all on fire. So, I mean, part of the reason they win is because they've got all of these really kind of guerrilla tactics that work for them, and also weather works in their favor. And the Spanish kind of shoot themselves in the foot with these green barrels. As a result of beating the most powerful navy on Earth at the time, Spain kind of loses its power in general. It had been sort of a European superpower because of this incredible navy. Now, because that navy is defeatable, the Spanish are not considered quite as impressive or as powerful anymore. If you look at this as a straight Catholic versus Protestant war and the Protestants win, it means that God is not on the Catholic side. And that's how a lot of people read this battle when the Protestants beat the Catholics. And then finally, by getting rid of or by defeating the Spanish Armada, or by getting rid of a lot of these ships, by beating a bunch of these ships, they also open up the sea lanes so that the English can get to the New World and colonize and do some of start some of those things here especially in the Americas, in North America, because the Spanish can't keep them from doing it because they don't have the ships to do it with anymore. Sir Walter Raleigh is the second bit of her highlight of her reign. He's somebody who chartered. He created a charter to set up the first permanent settlements in America, and created joint stock companies, which were between the English government, between Elizabeth herself, really. And these are the places that she would profit from it, and England would profit from whatever they did there. The first settlement doesn't exactly work really well. Roanoke, who knows what happened to them. But eventually they get colonies that work, and they're making big money on tobacco, especially as an import. William Shakespeare is a product of her reign. He survives her. She dies before he does. And he also does plays for her successor. Sorry. But I mean, he's considered the greatest playwright, right, in the English language, and he's a part of, and she supports him. She's one of those people who is a patron of his and helps him to put together a company and write these plays. And then, of course, Drake circumnavigates the globe and under the reign of Elizabeth I. He's the first one to make it all the way around the earth. And so, I mean, all of these things are really important things that she does. Elizabeth I is not any slouch. She is a great queen, and she leads a country into greatness, which is a fantastic thing.